Welcome everybody to day 2 of the CityDAO Academic Conference. This is our afternoon session, and we are very pleased to begin with a distinguished panel to discuss the topic of K-12 Web3 education. So I'd like to introduce our panelists and give each person a moment to please introduce themselves. We'll start with Jonny from DAO Academy.
Hey, thanks for having me here. I'm Jonny. Everybody calls me Jonny Ringo, and I've been working with a few different DAOs for the past couple of years, mostly in community building and really getting strong into the education aspect of it, trying to bridge that gap between what builders are building and what the community is actually using from a user standpoint. So that's what I'm here for.
Great, welcome. Next we have Mike Peck.
Hi, how you doing? It is, yes. She was just able to join us.
Okay. So we have Mike Peck and Vridi from Ed3. Mike, please, first.
Sure. Yeah, no, thanks again for having us. My name is Mike Peck. So I've been in the public school system, never really left. After graduating, went into college and then went on to work in a public school where I've been for the last 15 years. Was in the classroom for about 7 of those years and now lead a technology department at a public school district in Pennsylvania. Relevant to Web3, spent some time in the space going back to the last bull market and then really never left. Got more involved in DAOs, contributing to a couple of them along the way, and then working with Vridi and our other co-founder Michael to found Ed3 DAO, where we're working on bringing education into the public school system. I'll let Vridi introduce herself and tell you a little more too.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us. I apologize about my attire, the hatch. It's Labor Day weekend, so we're at a lake. So I'm Vridi Saraf. I'm an educator, first and foremost. I've spent time as a teacher through Teach for America and as a dean. And then I train deans across charter schools. And then we help scale those charter schools from 2 to 15 in Brownsville, Brooklyn. And then I spent 2.5 years traveling around the world building schools and building the infrastructure for professional development for educators and also training school principals on how to build really great schools. And then last year I started a company called K-20 Educators, which is an organization that's helping build metaverse spaces and environments for learning communities, specifically educators. And I co-founded Ed3 DAO with Mike in an effort to educate educators about Web3.
Thank you, Vridi, and welcome. And we have Ruben from the Digital Currency Initiative.
Hey, everybody. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me. My name is Ruben. I'm just now realizing I should be regretting the fact that I don't have a cool nickname like Jonny Ringo. But I have worked for a long time at the intersection of blockchain and education. A big chunk of that has been mostly at the university level. I work with a lot of students with my role at MIT. And then I also run a blockchain education initiative over at Stanford Law School. But maybe more relevant for this panel, I lead some research at CoinDesk on the university's team. And a big chunk of that is trying to figure out how to get more high school age students into blockchain. How do we present that to them? How do we funnel them into those kinds of programs at the university level? So that's kind of the professional side. Anecdotally, I have a couple nephews that have heard way too much about blockchain, and they're much younger, and I'm sure they're sad about that. But yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Welcome. And we have the moderator for today's panel is Sarah from both CityDAO and Be Humane DAO.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah from Croatia. And I founded Be Humane based on my master's thesis on socially and emotionally intelligent usage of technology. And we are building a safe metaverse for kids to develop soft skills. And I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, everybody. And so we're just going to have kind of an open panel discussion about the use of Web3 and K-12 and the future of this kind of education. The first question is, in some ways, how do we protect children from technology that could actually potentially be dangerous in terms of, we've all seen in the crypto market how volatile things are. Is it a good idea that kids should be exposed to technology? Is it in any way being comfortable around guns? That they don't understand the consequences of what they might be able to create? Before we get into the future of education, is this something that educators should think about, that these are dangerous technologies? And I'll turn it over to Sarah to please just moderate, lead.
Yeah, Jonny?
Oh, it's funny, the terminology you use, looking at this technology like a weapon. A guy who I consider my mentor in this space, that was one of his opening lines to me, was that this new technology is amazing and it will help a lot of people, but so did the musket. So it does definitely have to be taken with a grain of salt that this is brand new. People don't fully understand what the causality of this is going to be to the world. We're talking about rebuilding ecosystems from the ground up. Decentralization, if it spreads like we want it to, it could redo everything. So it definitely has to be taken with a bit of en garde of this. This could be devastating if we don't take it in the right direction. And recently events with market changes, DAOs, rug pulls even, it's a good indicator that right now we really need to be looking to our leadership to try and guide us through this period. Because even decentralization still has an original source that it comes from, an idea. And we have to keep that idea pure as we move forward, and we have to, well, educate, because if we don't, then people are going to kind of take it and run with it, and we're going to see rug pulls, and we're going to see things happen that we don't want to in this area. So yeah, I definitely think that it should be looked at like a weapon where, I was taught to, hold a pistol at a very young age. And I'm not saying that everybody should do that, but I am saying that if you expect this to affect the next generation like we hope it does, that we should teach them as early as possible how to handle it.
I think Jonny Ringo brought up a really interesting point. So there's kind of two flip sides here that I find really fascinating. There's this idea that to some extent, like all technology, maybe I'll don't want to make that strong statement, but there is an argument for protecting children from technology, especially this immutable worldwide technology. I think about myself, and I'm very glad that I didn't grow up in the age where now potentially some tweets that I made 5 or 10 years ago could cost me a job or a college admission or something like that, because I was pretty dumb when I was 12, 13, 14, and older. But there's a flip side, which is maybe there's some amount of protecting this technology from children that we need to do. And I think that's something that maybe Jonny was intimating a little bit. So something that I worry about is if we go in and we're teaching children who are too young about something like blockchain, what is it that they're going to picture? So right now, I think we're all of maybe a certain generation, we think about blockchain in a certain way, and we have values like decentralization, and we have values like equity and openness and transparency. But if we do this wrong, the next generation, if they don't have the context around blockchain and why it's important, maybe they think of it as a purely financial tool for their own financial gain or something like that. And that could do a lot to warp not only what blockchain becomes, but how it interacts with the world, and it could hamstring its ability to really do good.
Yeah, I would second that. And the way that I like to think about it is, the reason why Web3 is different than, like, let's say guns, is because of the value that it actually provides if it's used for good. And the things that people would be missing out on, kids would be missing out on if they didn't engage in it in a positive way. And that's obviously very different than guns, because if you never touched a gun in your life, it wouldn't make a difference, right? But with Web3, there is such a huge deficit if you're not engaging with it, or just the internet in general. And so it's really about how do we how do we ensure that there's more good actors than bad actors? How do we ensure that there's parameters and infrastructure and frameworks that we're setting up so that people can engage with this technology in a way that's like conducive and regenerative to the world? And how do we, the thing that, is most exciting for me about Web3 is not only the tech, but it's about the principles and the ethos behind it. So how are we actually teaching kids about, the regenerative side of it, the immersive side of it, the, global and community side of it, the game theory side of it, and sort of in my mind, like blockchain is just another technology practicalize those principles. And in my opinion, I don't think blockchain is going to be the last decentralized technology to emerge to do the things that we can do right now. And I think there's going to be another version of it eventually. So it's really about like, how do we teach kids the ethos and the principles behind it, and then let them, adopt technologies that can sort of like serve those well.
Kind of a side question. I don't want to pull us on a tangent, but do you have a couple second spiel on when you think about what decentralized technology might look like in the future, or like kind of what is that new version maybe look like? Or maybe you haven't thought about it. I don't want to put you on the spot, but that got me curious.
No, I mean, I'm not. It's and the way that I think about this is like, if we think about the evolution of decentralization, like the concept of decentralization isn't new, right? So we've had co-ops, we've had communes, we've had unbundled learning to some extent, and all of these sort of like systems have existed for a long time, but they haven't been really successful because there haven't been enough frameworks around it and technological systems around the past and analog way. Blockchain is sort of like the further iteration of that. And if you think about like networks like Ceramic, or if you think about other networks that are like actually not using blockchain to decentralize data storage, like there's just going to be more versions of that, I think.
Thanks.
I wanted to comment on, so I think, and I would sort of align my answer most with Reedy's in that there's actually already analogs to this that we can draw back to as far as like what happens, with technologies when they get into the hands of kids. We already are seeing the repercussions of what happens when we don't teach about responsible use of technology to kids in the form of social media. Being in a school, we're now playing catch up, and we're trying to teach kids how to responsibly use technology when for years we did not. And what you see in, some of the challenges that we see in our public schools and even beyond is a result of the use of technology by kids and even adults who they don't really have a concept of how to responsibly use it. And so they teach their kids, how they use technology. And so you end up getting like, the Facebook warriors who become challenges for our, school leadership and school administrators, because parents, act a certain way in the internet and the kids see that and think it's okay. So we saw it with Web 2 that if we kind of stay on the sidelines of teaching this technology in schools, what can happen? And so I would think that it's really important at this juncture, now seeing kind of the emergence of this next iteration of the web, that we consider very strongly, how do we bring these things into school in a responsible way, but also with some urgency too as well, because what we see now as kind of this emergent thing with Web3 is going to just become the internet in a matter of 5 to 10 years. And if we say 10 years, it's more likely going to be 3 to 5 years, just because of the way things move exponentially in the web. And so I think it's very important that we get these tools in the hands of kids, and that's going to require a really substantial lift on a lot of people's parts, mostly because we don't have the bandwidth of people who are working in schools and understand the technology, but also because we have really misaligned incentives at the public education level, particularly in the U.S., where focus is largely on test scores still and things of that nature. So I think it's really, really important that we start to move this technology into schools in a responsible way, not leaving it to the devices of our parents and kids at home who are already participating in the space, but may not fully understand the power that it holds.
Mike, I've always, oh, sorry, go ahead, sir.
It's okay. You can ask.
I just had maybe a quick follow-up for Mike, because you're saying something really interesting, and I think you have maybe some good insights here. But do you have a sense of what the root is of irresponsible technology use? Because I agree with you that is happening, and it's a huge problem. But is it because we're teaching it wrong, or we're teaching it too early, or is it that we're just in trouble, and humans are just kind of constitutionally incapable of wielding technology in a safe way?
Yeah, it's tough to identify a root cause. I would say that largely schools have stayed out of it. Now, I started in education right around the time where social media was starting to emerge. So like 2009 was like my first year teaching. So I mean, I kind of taught all the way through the emergence of social media, and then really the mass adoption of it. And I think what happened, this is just my opinion, but schools stay out of it. There wasn't a lot of thought as to what the power of this could be, and corporations understood human behavior well enough to build these platforms in a way that people adopted them very quickly and used them to the way that these social media platforms wanted them to use it. And so what you had happen is really economics and corporate incentives and alignment and interests and values really became the way that we used a lot of this, at least initially. And so you end up getting kind of just the adoption based upon usage that was predetermined by those who were building it. So that's just my take. But I think a lot of what we see today is the result of schools standing on the sidelines, not really understanding how this is going to play a part in their school systems until now.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that the fact that Generation Z is the first digitally native generation. So to Mike's point, we had parents that didn't know how to handle that education, and now we're having the entire system that doesn't know what to do about it. And it was interesting in the context of the research that I did. One of the students said that he compared technology to driving a car. But you go to school to learn how to drive a car, and you're getting taught by adults. While with technology, you're just released onto it. You don't have any guidance, any instruction as to how to do it in a healthy manner. So I think that we now are creating that space and conversation about what are the healthier usage of technology. And there's one big NGO here in New York, and All Tech is Human, that is drawing a larger pipeline to conversations about responsible technology usage, because so far we have only had developers and technical people building the tech. Now we have actually psychologists who are also involved, social workers and educators. And to that point, I actually wanted to ask Riti and Mike, do you have any examples in CityDAO of what kind of instructions are you giving to your educators, and how are they teaching the students about Web3 and in general about technology?
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. And I was actually going to add that one of the reasons, I think one of the root causes why tech is often misused is because it's so vast what you can do with it. There's so many things. Like if you're thinking about driving a car, there's really a few things that you can do to drive a car. But with technology, there's so many opportunities, so many possibilities for how you could use it and for what it could actually provide. Like it actually powers so many other things. And so I think it's actually impossible to teach a kid to interface with every part of the internet, right? And to teach them how to be, ethical, in social media versus being ethical when you're on a community chat versus when you're ethical on, how you build apps and things like that. So I think it's actually it's not a very, I think, efficient or possible activity to actually teach a kid how to use every part of the internet ethically. So I think it's more about how do you instill ethics in kids, right? So it's like no matter what they're interfacing with, they're actually able to, do the right thing, make the right decision, use critical thinking to sort of like do that. And so that's actually how we have built our credentials that are teaching Web3 to educators so that they can teach it to students. We're definitely teaching educators about what Web3 is, what blockchain is, how NFTs work, all that. But undergirding everything that we talk about are the ethos and the principles of it. So we talk about, like, for example, metaverse course that we have, we talk about immersive learning. We talk about why immersive learning is so important. We talk about why immersive experiences are important, why enhanced experiences are important, how to engage with people virtually, what value does the metaverse bring? And then we also like give them experiences in the metaverse. When we talk about DeFi, we don't just teach them about, how the decentralized finance system work. We teach them financial literacy. We teach them about tokenomics. We teach them about game theory. We teach them about, all these sort of undergirding, principles so that if DeFi transforms into something else, they can still make decisions and use critical thinking to apply tokenomics and game theory and the literacy of the finance system to be able to sort of evolve with the system. So we're really like trying to find like what are those like principal proficiencies that can be like evergreen lifetime proficiencies that can continue even course with this technology. So that's sort of how we're thinking about it and how we talk about it with educators.
Can we turn to a question that Mike just asked, which was how do we create sandboxes where young learners can explore this tech in a responsible way? And if I could just give an example, the last two semesters, I started a trading club for the students where I was trying to teach them how to read charts. And within a very short time, some student was like, well, this isn't fun unless we're using real money. And everybody was like, yeah, we should use real money. And then some kid was like, have you seen the chart for this thing? And then the other kids were like, I think I could spare like $200. And I had to shut it down immediately. They were about to throw all of their available money at things they didn't, but it just spun out of control because it wasn't a sandbox. And it's so easy, I feel like, with any of this technology to go from let's study tokenomics to let's buy the newest altcoin we saw.
My question is, with building a sandbox, like when I think about the overall structure and idealism of Web3, and I think of a sandbox, how would you integrate those two ideas together? Because even the public school system now, it's centralized. You go to a building, you all together in a room and learn the same thing without any input on what you're learning. So how do we, and I'm not saying that I wouldn't have ideas how to, but how would we create that sandbox environment without basically butchering the concept of, Web3 and decentralization? And that is kind of the duality of the problem that we're faced with, is that the whole concept of decentralization is that you have all these outward sources of information and input, and you have to bring those together, not in a centralized way, but they have to mesh. They have to come together at some intersection. So I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts on how that could be sandboxed into something contained, but that still has that Web3 root in it,
Go ahead, Ruben.
Go ahead, Mike. No, I've talked, please.
Well, just really quick, I think that's a really good point, Johnny. It's like antithetical, to put kids in a sandbox and say, here you go, here's Web3. Like it doesn't really align with the values. I think just a quick example. So one of the things that, like a very simple pedagogical strategy that most teachers will use at some point is the I do, we do, you do strategy, where it's like a gradual release. And you can get far more nuanced than that. But if we think of it as sort of like this gradual release where we work together to understand the concept, we practice it in a way that doesn't require you to necessarily, actually engage or possibly, we're walking through the concept of like buying an NFT together. and then we send you on your way to kind of practice. Now, the part that I always struggle with is that teachers release kids to do homework, and the homework is the hardest part, and kids don't always have the same support at home. So like, let's make sure that we're doing the modeling and the practice together. But I think that strategy is one way that we can kind of create like a sandbox, in a sense, where we have a really set piece of, or a set an important set of strategies that we can use to go from zero to, actually participating on their own. And I think one of the nice parts is that most blockchains incorporate some kind of test nets that can be used, without any kind of, real life implications.
Yeah, and I can add a slightly different perspective to that. I don't think there's any like one way to do it. I think there's a lot of experimentation that needs to happen. There's a school of thought about introducing concepts to students in a way that allows them to build upon those concepts and create the concepts from ground up. So there's this math teacher called Dan Myers. I don't know if anyone has heard of him. He, started seeing these like math problems where, kids were asked to figure out like what the slope was, or what the, volume of something was, or whatever. And he just thought that was such a bad way to teach a child about volume or slope, because it only taught them how to like learn the algorithm and learn like formulas. And so what he started doing was he started like bringing jugs of water into his classroom, and it was like, how long do you think it's going to take to fill this jug of water? And so the kids were like, okay, well, how fast is the water flowing? Well, how big is the water tank? What if we change like, the rate of the water, then how fast will it flow? And all these kind of questions. And so they started asking more questions about how to solve the problem, which actually helped them solve the problem. And I give that example because I think the sandbox should operate the same way. We should present a variable to students, and we should say, okay, so this is what decentralization is trying to accomplish. This is potentially the outcome, or this is what a blockchain is trying to accomplish. So what questions do you have to try to figure out how to create an environment in a sandbox that could allow you to solve some of these problems, and actually create a model that, emulates this sort of like decentralized model, and sort of like allow kids to like create that sort of space on their own. And then even set the parameters to be like, listen, right now, because we are in a school underage environment, you're not going to be able to use real currency, but like, how can we simulate that same experience in a way that is exciting for you, in a way that like, you feel really sort of like motivated by? And so, kids might say, well, what if we actually gifted like, fake tokens to each other? And, every time somebody got a fake token, it equated to like, being able to play in recess a little bit longer, whatever, consequences they wanted. And so I think like allowing students to set those parameters and create the rules and the framework of the sandbox itself, I think will invest them more in being able to do those things without having like, quote, real stakes, but then still have like enough real value in their setting and in their context to make it valuable.
Interesting. I would like to ask more about the incentives with tokens. Like, what are your opinions about incentivizing students to do certain behaviors with tokens in the education system?
Anyone? Me? Anyone?
Sarah, can you rephrase that one more time?
Yeah, so the question is about incentivizing students via tokens. So we know that children love different type of incentives, and we wanted to explore so with the crypto credentials and what will go on blockchain, what will stay off chain. So would like to hear your opinion about that.
I think if you were to look at a school, like just the concept you're talking about, if you were to look at a school more like a DAO, and have it run a lot more like one, then you could have a token that has no money backing. You could even do it on testnet and use it as basically like a point system. Like I remember when I was a kid in kindergarten, they would give you gold stars on a little chart if you, completed a task or, did really good on a grade or something. So you could totally flip that into a DAO. Give everybody a little more say because, oh, hey, you earned, this token. You can use that token to vote on what we're going to have for lunch on Friday because everybody loves Friday lunches, and even little things like that. That's going to help bridge the gap, especially for children, is not overcomplicating it. It's just giving them something simple and being like, here, you earned your gold star because you did your homework, got a good grade. Here's your token. Go spend it how you will as a voting right on, Friday's lunch, or, maybe everybody gets to vote on an extra week off for summer or a field trip. And that would give kids an incentive system that is completely separate from money, allow them to have a say in what they're doing, but still allow for that leadership aspect for the teachers to give them the direction of, here's the choices. We know that, these 10 things are good choices for these children to choose from. So let's give them the choice. And I don't want to call it an illusion of choice because it's not. The kid still gets to choose among those things. Oh, hey, this is what I want to vote for. But there's still that little bit of leadership there from the adults, from the people who care that this is going in the right direction. And I think that is a way that could be melded together, where you could take this voting incentive mechanism and earning like grades and whatnot, and put it towards the child being able to like feel that incentive.
I think one of the underlying concepts here is the concept of extrinsic motivation versus intrinsic motivation. And most teachers and most schools have relied on extrinsic motivation because it's the easier thing to do to motivate a child to, quote, behave or do the things that they want them to do. And this is like persistent across all schools, all countries, the entire world. Even parents use extrinsic motivators quite a bit. And I don't think there's anything necessarily terrible about it, but I think that there are arguments to be made about how, if you're constantly motivating a kid by stars or by rewards or by external factors, then they will never develop that sort of internal scope to be able to, do the right thing when they should do it. And that's really, really hard to do. I was a teacher, and it was really hard to build that intrinsic motivation in kids. And so I think starting off with extrinsic motivators in the way that Jonny Ringo just described it, I think is actually a really good activity to do. But you want to wean kids off of those extrinsic motivators, and you actually want to instill those values in them so that they become more intrinsically motivated to do those things. And usually you get more motivated by understanding the underlying reason behind things and underlying benefits that a kid would get even if they didn't get that external reward. And so that sort of that's the gradual sort of release into intrinsic motivation is really, really, really hard to do. But that's sort of I think the goal of where schools want to head. But there haven't been very good teacher development systems or professional development that teaches teachers how to do that. And I think DAOs and Web3 are going to experience a similar thing where I think we're going to go almost into a pendulum where most people join DAOs because they're really motivated by the mission and the values of it. And then eventually, once they spend a lot of time on it, they're like, wait a minute, I should start getting paid for my work. And then they need those extrinsic value motivators. But then eventually we're not going to be able to pay them enough to stay unless they're back in the middle where they're both intrinsically motivated and extrinsically motivated. And I think that's sort of the equilibrium that we need to strike with kids too, but it's super hard to do. And there's all these sort of schools of thoughts on and professional development on how to actually make that happen. But yeah, it's hard to do.
I like the point you bring up there about the transition. And, as a dad, I should be thinking more that way myself, because I have that conversation with my own wife about I want my kids to have the motivation to go out and do things on their own and get that intrinsic value from it. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because my idea is maybe great for, younger age, but they do need that transition. And that's, I think, where the balance is probably going to be the hardest, is finding how to transition that, even using tools like Web3.
I think one of the challenges in moving away from systems so I dropped into the chat. There are systems that already exist that are building kind of these token systems. One that we just put in place is called PBIS, which is oh my gosh, why am I drawing a blank? Positive behavioral incentive, and the idea is that kids, through their behavior, aligning to specific behaviors in the school, desired outcomes, they get points for those behaviors when they're demonstrated. But it creates a very interesting dynamic where teachers are levering distributing these points in a way that can be somewhat harmful to sort of the classroom culture, and then those students can then use those points and redeem them for certain things. I think one of the challenges that we see is structurally schools are designed to be systems that kids enter and they get processed because there are systems in place to ensure they meet certain outcomes at each step of the way. And I think those systems, those structures kind of bound us in terms of how a token could really be used, that like we see in DAOs, where it could be used as a tool for governance or decision making, for value attribution. And I think a lot of those limitations that we would see in a traditional school setting is because of just the structures that are in place. So I think to really see the launch of tokens and tokens really, have an impact in the school setting, we're really going to need to address kind of the infrastructure that really the schools are built around now. And so I think what's really important, and a way for us to really have some impact now, is to begin to serve as the liaisons between what's actually happening in the world of Web3, finding those promising practices and seeding them where we can in schools as they exist now, and then along the way building parallel systems if we can that really hopefully will replace the current systems we have right now.
Yes, and I think it's also very important to have in mind at what stage of children's development are we introducing tokens and as a reward system, because when they're younger, they're more susceptible to have the validation driven from being increasingly motivated, and that they create this inner belief that if I want to be, if my dad is going to be happy about me, I have to do this and that type of behavior, and it's dangerous to introduce that in education system as well. So I think it's really, like, for example, with teenagers, we can explore that more in depth, because for them, one of the biggest thing about being a teen is to develop the identity of self, and to explore to different things, that who am I as a person, and giving them tokens as a reward system for them to have some autonomy and agency over their decisions, and inclusion in the curriculum development, I think would be very empowering for them in the college years and later in life. And since we have a couple of more minutes to end, I would like to end with the questions regarding about the gradings and diplomas and whether or not they should be on blockchain. So could you please share a little bit more about that? Mike and Rudy are working a lot on crypto credentials and diplomas. So
I feel like we haven't heard from Ruben in a while, so I'd love to hear from him.
Ruben is still here. I'm sorry.
I did drop off for a minute, some network issues, but I'm back, so I apologize. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting, and in a lot of ways, the idea of blockchain as really just this immutable ledger that tracks things like finances or things like credentials, right? I mean, that's kind of where it shines, and there are a lot of projects that are really that are leaning into this and saying maybe we should be putting credentials on blockchain. I think the big value to that, though, it has a lot of parallels to the financial system, right? We think about something like Bitcoin, and the big conversation and argument that I have with people is they say, well, we have PayPal, we have money transfers. Why do we need something like Bitcoin? And the answer is because you have this. It's a decentralized way of recording that you own something, and that's helpful if you're fleeing a dictator, right? You can keep your life savings, some wealth at least, some value in your head and access it via something like a seed phrase. And I think this is maybe not valuable for me. I am I'm just a young adult living in the United States, and there's no real immediate risk that I'm going to get a tremendous education and then have to flee my country and start over. But for some people, that really matters. And the normalizing doing these things like putting credentials on an immutable ledger that can be accessed if you have to drop everything and run, might not help us on this call, but it could do a lot to help other people. So I like the idea. I think we need to think about how to do it safely, like anything else in blockchain. But it's one of the few things that I hear that I'm not immediately fundamentally kind of opposed to.
I think this is brings up a bit of the point that Vitalik made not too long ago about soulbound tokens, and basically having a living record of your data attached to your profile on the chain. And I think that this is something that leans heavily into that if we were to integrate it with stuff that has to do with you as a person, your certificates and everything, that something like soulbound tokens would come in handy. I don't 100% know if that's the answer though, because there is drawbacks to immutability with things like that, because in a professional sense, sometimes something needs to be deleted or changed. So there is more research I think needs to be done on that. But the idea that you can store your certificates even without a soulbound token on chain, like through Arweave or even on Ethereum itself, I think will be huge in the future because of the permanence aspect of it. Because there are things that need to be permanent and need to always be accessible, like give you my content address to my online resume, something as simple as that. But I know it's there because it's on chain, and I can give someone that address and they can see it. So I think for certificates, it'll be a huge segue into just helping people with the simple things of just having it all together in one place and always accessible on demand.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think it's actually a little bit of a chicken before the egg kind of thing. So like, yes, it would be awesome. And, there are a lot of universities and schools that are putting transcripts on chain. So, last month, the state of Maharashtra, which has half the population of the United States, put 100,000 transcripts on chain, right? And it really did simplify and make more efficient their transcript systems. But I think the question is, what are we putting on chain and for what reason? Like, aside from having decentralized identities and being able to own your transcript. And I think the bigger question is like, do we want to put grades on chain? Because what do grades really tell us today, right? If Sarah gets an A and I get a B, does that mean that Sarah is smarter than me at something, or does it mean that she's a better test taker, right? And so the question is like, can we put portfolios on chain, right? So if Sarah created a robot and I created, a biological system where I recreated an aquaponic system or whatever, and that project itself is put on chain, the journey, the reflections, the artifacts that I created are put on chain and not the grade itself, then people who are looking at that transcript or looking at that, on-chain credential can say, oh, well, Sarah and Bree both got Bs, but Sarah actually is really good at robotics and Bree's really good at aquaponics, right? And that has so much more value than like the A's and B's and C's and whatever. I mean, at this point, like those don't really have any value anyway. Like there are so many universities, especially Ivy League, that are actually allowing students to not submit SAT scores, but submit portfolios instead to get into Stanford, to get into MIT. And the reason they're doing that is because they see the value of proficiency-based and competency-based education, and to see, what can you actually do rather than like how good are you at studying. So like if we're thinking about putting transcripts on chain, then sure, in order to get the infrastructure started, let's put whatever we have now. But like this really begs the conversation of how do we restart the system? How do we rethink the system? How do we like make sure that we're actually putting things on chain that have value and that present the real reflection of what a kid can actually do versus what the kid can sort of like perform on a test.
Just really quick, I know we're at almost at time here, but I saw a comment that was in the chat that Jonathan Reyes had said, and just to kind of build on what Vridi was saying. And there's a lot of things to be hashed out yet with regard to what goes on chain, but what doesn't. But I think what really excites me about the idea of having credentials being on chain is that in the same way that DAOs are creating a way where people can contribute to the organization, and the organization as the whole can recognize that value creation through the attribution of tokens or some other way of giving capital to the people who contribute. We go through our lives and we spend all of our lives learning everywhere we go, whether we're in our homes or watching YouTube and learning things, or doing service projects or with NGOs or community organizations. Learning is happening all throughout our lives. And I think what's really exciting is that through some different thinking on systems, like Vridi was saying, that we might be able to build systems that attribute learning to learners when it happens, not just through a grade in a school. Because the four walls of the school doesn't mean, if you're outside of it, that the learning ends. And so I'm hopeful that we're able to create systems that allow organizations, whether they're NGOs or community organizations, schools included, and others, through internships and externships, that those things can be recorded in a way that becomes helpful to me as the learner who's gathering those skills, and then using them to propel myself further in the career that I hope to pursue. So a lot to be decided yet, but I think there's a lot of potential here that exists for us to really give power, shift power, I should say, away from schools into the hands of the learner.
Well, on that note, I think we're at time, so I want to thank all of the panelists very much. This was certainly a very engaging panel. I feel like I learned a lot. I'm really grateful for it. So thank you very much to Jonny Ringo from DAO Academy, Mike and Vridi from Ed3DAO, Ruben from DCI, MIT and Stanford, and Sarah from Be Humane DAO and CityDAO for hosting. Thanks, everybody. It was a great panel.